welcome to the Heartful Parent Podcast. I'm your host, Christy Keating. In this podcast, we talk about it all, our parenting, our partnering, and our professional lives, because they are all a part of us, and we were never meant to do this alone. Hey listeners, welcome back to another week on the Heartful Parent Podcast. So thrilled to have you here. Today's conversation, I have to say, caught me a little bit by surprise because it was one of those conversations that was far more interesting. I'm going to be really honest with you. It was far more interesting and helpful than I think I imagined that it might be. And I suspect you are going to find the same thing. So today on the podcast, we have Dr. Marianne Little. Dr. Little is a clinical psychologist who has been in private practice for over 4 decades. She is currently an adjunct professor at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center at Dallas and has served as an adjunct professor in the departments of psychology and special education at the University of Texas at Dallas. She authored the book, Loving Your Children Better, Matching Parenting Styles to the Age and Stage of Your Children, Cooperation Station, which is an educational toy for kids and families. And she also authored the Competent Kids series. She's been a consultant in numerous educational and psychiatric facilities and frequently lectures to both lay and professional audiences. However, today we're not here talking about any of those books. We're actually talking about her new book and the research that she did for it. And this is a book called Childhood Narcissism: Strategies to Raise Unselfish, Unentitled, and Empathetic Children. Now, you may hear the title of that book as I did and think, well, this doesn't really apply to me. My kid's not a narcissist. And here's why I say, or why I said that this interview ended up being a really pleasant surprise and much more helpful than maybe I thought it might be, because what Dr. Little shares is that narcissism is on a spectrum, and we're actually seeing an increase in narcissism that is stemming from the way that parenting has shifted and changed, and the way that many of us are parenting or interpreting what's being recommended in parenting. And so she really focuses on, like, how do we avoid that? How do we avoid raising a child who ends up with, the dangerous type of narcissism, and raise somebody instead who is unselfish, unentitled, empathetic, and who actually has a drive, an internal drive for excellence. And I love this conversation, not just because it was, ended up being so much more valuable than I think I initially expected, but also because it overlays so nicely on positive discipline and the framework for positive discipline, which I think many of you have heard me talk about, and we will keep talking about it. So Dr. Little shares some great tips and tools and strategies and just things that we all really need to know as parents. So with that intro, I will let her kind of explain in more depth, but I think you're going to find this one pretty interesting. So without further ado, Dr. Marianne Little. Dr. Little, welcome to the Heartful Parent Podcast. I'm so excited to have you here and to dig into a topic that we have never dug into on the podcast before.
I'm glad to have this opportunity, especially to talk about something new to your podcast.
Yes. So, okay, we're going to be talking about narcissism. I shared that with the listeners in the intro. Tell me, how does one get interested in this topic, and not just interested, but interested enough to write a book about it?
That's a wonderful question. But I would actually tell you that I got to narcissism through the back door. And by that, I would explain that over the years, more and more of my patients were either children of narcissists, married to a narcissist, had a boss that was a narcissist, a next door neighbor that was a narcissist, or was concerned about children in a school that appeared to be budding narcissists. So while I never actually intended to write a book about narcissism, it became clear to me that I needed to have skills in both understanding and working with people who had narcissistic issues.
Okay. Okay. So now a lot of us hear the word narcissist, and I think it's actually almost gets, bandied about in conversations sometimes, like, oh, he's such a narcissist or she's such a narcissist. But it's actually a diagnosis, right? And so talk to us a little bit about what the diagnosis is, what it really is. And is there a difference between the understanding that a professional would have of narcissism or narcissistic disorder and sort of the layperson's understanding of narcissism?
Yeah, let me go ahead. That's a wonderful question, but let me give you a little background, and I'm going to make it hard for you for just a second. I'm going to ask you a question back.
Uh-huh.
Is there such a thing as healthy narcissism as you understand it?
So that is that's a great and challenging question.
I'm going to answer it, but I just want to know what your your quick takeaway might be.
Oh gosh, quick takeaway. Well, by virtue of the fact that you're asking it, I have to imagine that probably yes.
Yeah.
That there is, but
right.
but that's not how we usually understand it.
Exactly. And that's why I asked the question. It's one I often ask when I lecture. And most people don't really understand that not only is narcissism healthy, but you actually have to have it. It's actually essential. So healthy narcissism really fuels the drive to connect, to achieve, to be somebody, to find fulfillment. And if you don't have enough narcissism, you actually are in trouble. And in professionally speaking, there's something called deficient narcissism where you actually don't have enough. But we won't go there today. But I will tell you that it exists on a continuum. And on one side of the continuum is what I would call healthy narcissism. And on the other tail end is pathological narcissism. And that is, technically speaking, what we diagnose, which is self-concept with disordered relationships. And it's actually called a narcissistic personality disorder. Now, what actually is interesting is that between healthy narcissism and, if you will, extremely unhealthy narcissism, there are tendencies and there are traits. And people move from healthy narcissism and certain things happen such they end up in this pathological disorder. But I'll tell you, that's one of the other reasons why I started writing about this, because technically speaking, I can't diagnose pathological narcissism until someone is 18 years of age.
Okay.
And for the most part, that disorder is considered untreatable.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about it, then, if there are the possibilities to have tendencies and traits, and then you end up with a pathological disorder that you can't do anything about, it only made sense to me that we ought to intervene in childhood to try to get people on a healthy path so that we could avoid ending up with a tremendously dysfunctional disorder.
Right.
And so that's where I started.
Okay. I feel like my brain is just firing on all cylinders. I mentioned to you before we hit record that in my previous professional life as an attorney prosecuting sexually violent predators, I encountered a number of people who qualified, with a diagnostic and statistical manual as having narcissistic personality disorder. So that's on the unhealthy end of the spectrum.
That's it.
And I do recall some of the professionals that we worked with, some of the psychologists and psychiatrists saying that you can't diagnose it before 18. But what I'm hearing you say is that there's some things that we might be noticing before the age of 18 where intervention might actually be impactful. So
yes.
Talk to me a little bit about what are some of those, traits and some of the signs, if you will, that a parent or a professional might start to notice and say, hey, this is a kid that might need some support.
Absolutely. What makes narcissism a little bit tricky to identify and ultimately pin down is that because there is healthy narcissism, and then there's at the other end a narcissistic personality disorder, these tendencies and traits are developing in sort of an interesting way. There are a number of tendencies and traits that should develop. And by that, I can name them specifically. Empathy should increase. Cooperative relationships should increase. The ability to interact more meaningfully with others should increase. So we're seeing some skills that we hadn't seen previously. You don't see that in very young children. At the same time, some other characteristics should be fading. Self-centeredness should fade, and bullying should fade, and envy should fade, and a grandiose sense of the self should fade. So the diagnosis is made for people like me trying to intervene in those years before 18 is are the things coming in that should, such as empathy, and are things waning as they should, such as self-centeredness?
Okay, I have certainly never heard it described like that there's, these things that we start to see more of and things that we want to see less of. And so my older child is a teenager, as many of the listeners have heard me say. And I find the teen years so fascinating because they are in many ways so self-centered. So when we say that we should see that waning, like how do we discern what's kind of normal, developmentally appropriate self-centeredness and when we should be going, we got a problem?
Well, the critical differentiation is made on whether that self-centeredness is so all-encompassing that they don't have regard for the feelings of other people. Okay. So a child can be incredibly preoccupied about my boyfriend and what I'm going to wear to the prom, and I don't have time to talk to my little sister because I really just care if my shoes are going to match my dress. But at the same time, if she can be attentive and thoughtful to her friends or still remember it's your birthday, then we're seeing that it's not overwhelming her entire day-to-day life. And the more all-encompassing it is, the more dangerous it has the potential to be.
Gotcha. Okay, I think that's a great explanation of, yes, there are things that they are just, that I think as I see my daughter and her friends and, that they're kind of naturally focused on that feel to an adult as kind of self-centered. Mm-hmm. But the empathy and the attention to her friends' feelings and all of those things I'm seeing come up in a huge way. And even I'm noticing her understanding that her parents are human.
Well, and that's another indication of good development, because what she's saying is, I'm seeing things both I like and don't like about my parents. But if you can hold some part of a positive relationship while you're going through that exploration, that again is a good sign.
Yes. Okay, so by the time somebody's over the age of 18 and they're on the far end of the spectrum, they've got narcissistic personality disorder, what I'm hearing you say, there's really not much we can do about that. It's kind of considered untreatable. So that kind of begs the question, you talked about intervening when we see these tendencies and traits. Are there things that parents do, maybe completely inadvertently, that either encourage or discourage that unhealthy type of narcissism from developing?
Okay. Let me give you a little bit of a long answer. And I would just tell you, in my book, I go through and talk about the development of 4 structures. And if you can successfully build and encourage development for those 4 structures, you protect against narcissism. And I would tell you what these are. The first one is the child's self-concept. And if the child develops a realistic and appropriate self-concept, it will contribute to positive self-esteem. The second one has to do with the ability to emotionally regulate. And over time, children will learn how to become frustrated and manage their emotions in increasingly more age-appropriate ways. So kids start off tantruming and end up telling you, I'm mad at you in terrible words. You're a doo-doo head, and then you're, I hate you. And eventually it's, I don't agree with you at all on this. I think that's a ridiculous idea. And that is showing development and regulation.
Okay.
The next one has to do with the ability to perceive things accurately. And all that simply means is that they can see things and not be influenced by their biases. If you need to believe that the boy's going to invite you to the prom and you're ignoring information that he really hasn't been paying attention to you, then it means that your needs are influencing your perceptions. In its extreme form, this will end up being something labeled as gaslighting in the narcissistic literature.
Mm-hmm.
And the last one is a positive model of love and relationships. And over time, children will end up and decide on what it means to be loved, what it feels like to be loved, and whether you can trust in loving behavior from the people around you. If you get those four structures right, and in my book, I give specific examples with exchanges of how you talk to a 6-year-old about it versus a 9-year-old versus a 14-year-old versus a 16-year-old. And all of those things can be encouraged by parents. And because they're influenced by development, they change over time, but they get better over time.
Okay. So, I mean, as you describe those four things, as I'm listening to you, and I'm sure that the listeners are doing this as well, as I'm listening, I'm thinking about the things in my own parenting that I think support those. And we're probably all also wondering, what are we doing that we shouldn't be doing, right? Mm-hmm. That might sort of negatively be impacting those. So, maybe you can address that a little bit. Like, what are the big pitfalls that parents?
Yeah, I have a list of tips, but let me just start with the one that is most concerning, particularly in this day and age in this culture. And that is the pitfall of treating your child as special. And most parents believe that if I praise them enough and if I give, sort of treat them as special, it ensures a positive self-concept. Mm-hmm. But the literature has not supported that. And in fact, we have data that suggests that overvaluing children actually contributes to narcissism. We have actual research that shows us that.
Wow.
And so it tends to build in children a kind of self-centered and ultimately better than attitude, because if they're so special, in a certain way, they're not like the rest of us. And if you follow my logic here, if you're better than everybody else, then it also means that you should be entitled to special treatment, so that specialness backfires.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, because when you first say that, like the big pitfall is parents treating their children like they're special. I'm like, well, now, Dr. Little, my daughters are certainly special, right? Like, I mean, of course they are to me. So, and I'm sure a lot of parents are going, oh gosh, well, I feel like my kids are special. So am I, what have I done to foster that?
Well, I think, let me correct a little bit. I'm talking about treating them as special. So if you're making them breakfast by demand every day, you're treating them as special. Today I'd like pancakes, tomorrow I'd like eggs, the day after, please, cold cereal. No. Okay. And specialness can occur in all kinds of ways. Indulgence can be part of that. A lack of limit setting can be part of that. It is not unconditional love that I'm talking about, because one of my other points is the absolute necessity of unconditional love. But unconditional love that's predicated on the inside of the child, not the outside of the child.
Uh-huh.
So if the child gets the message that I'm loved because I make straight A's in English, or I get loved because I'm a prima ballerina, or I'm loved because I'm going to get a scholarship to Yale, to row crew, then we've confused the self-concept. And we've created a child with a sense of specialness that ultimately can injure them in the end.
So fascinating. And I find myself wondering because, we've seen a shift in parenting over the decades, right? And I mean, the listeners have heard me say this. So I'm 50. I grew up in the 70s and the 80s. And I think the shift was starting to happen, but certainly when my parents were growing up, it was very much parent in charge. It was very authoritarian style of parenting, right? Parent in charge, you do it because I said so, et cetera, et cetera. And then the research kind of showed us that, more authoritative parenting was a better way to go. But a lot of parents struggle with what that means. And they hear positive parenting or gentle parenting, and we end up with no boundaries and, and all of those things. So I've talked about that in other podcasts, and we'll probably continue talking about that in other podcasts. So that makes me wonder, are we seeing an increase in individuals, adults, who are ultimately diagnosed with the harmful, the bad side of the spectrum here, the narcissistic personality disorder, because of the way we're parenting collectively?
Well, it's a wonderful question, and I'm going to back up a little bit to answer the second part first, which is we do believe that narcissism is on the rise. But part of our problem with keeping track of what percentage of the population actually is narcissistic is that most narcissists actually don't show up for treatment. Right. Because they don't think anything's wrong with them. They think something's wrong with other people. And so because of that, our numbers do not indicate precisely how big the increase is.
Gotcha.
But now let me go back to the other part of your question, which is very well put. And you obviously know the literature and some of the research from Baumrind and other people. But I became interested in precisely that question in my book and ended up and generated some of my own thinking about it. And this is how my thinking went. Specifically, older parenting strategies focused on kind of a binary approach. You're either attentive or inattentive. You're either warm or you're not warm. You're either strict or you're lenient. And when you look at parenting from that kind of all or nothing perspective, you couldn't make sense of it, primarily because there's research that suggests all kinds of things that contribute to narcissism. One of them is harsh critical parenting. One of them is overvaluing and sort of special treatment parenting. Another one is indulgent parenting. And you put it all together and you'd say, well, this is too confusing. How can everything cause it? You can be too critical, too harsh. And so what I did was I put all the literature together and I created a new model, which basically says that we can look at parenting behaviors on a continuum, and that any behavior, you can have too much of it or too little of it. So even on the question of warmth, you could be overly warm in the same way that you could be not warm enough. On discipline, you could be too strict in the same way that you could be too lax. And I ended up and took all the data and all the theory and put them together. And I created and built a model with quadrants. And I generated 4 parenting types that are all different, that all contribute to narcissism. But they are all born on the ends of the continuums, where they gave either too much or too little in terms of the view of the child. And they either had too much or too little in terms of the treatment of the child, and it generated 4 types. Okay. One type is the hovering, I call the hovering directive type, and that's exactly what it sounds like. And those parents tend to create children that have the better than superior attitude.
Okay.
The indulgent permissive type is just what it sounds like, and those tend to create the entitled quality in a child. The critical, harsh parent tends to create a manipulative child. And the inattentive, disengaged type tends to create a disengaged child. And so that my new conceptualization says that what we're shooting for is the healthy center. Right. And I actually refer to it in my book as moderation parenting, where you're trying to hit the middle ground. And not to bore you to death, readers and listeners, but I go back and actually find the roots from Aristotle, who talked about you can have too much of basic or too little of basic values. And I just applied it to parenting.
I love that. There's a number of different frameworks for the sort of having 4 different types of parenting. So this resonates so well with with the way I think, because we've heard about authoritarian parenting, authoritative, and I can see how this could just sort of overlay or really complement that framework. So with moderation parenting, I mean, that sounds sort of obvious what that means, but it's not. And so I'd love to have you describe a little bit for the listeners of what you mean by moderation parenting and what is that happy center or middle that we're all trying to hit?
So in terms of the view of the child, that instead of seeing the child as special or seeing the child as defective, you just see the child as valuable and worthy. In the same way, in terms of treatment of the child, you're setting age-appropriate limits, and you're not doing excessive limits or no limits at all. And you're not doing excessive involvement or too little involvement. And so it's all the typical measures that you would think about in terms of parent management, and it's hitting the center, what I call the middle ground.
I mean, as you're talking, I'm a certified positive discipline educator, as some of the listeners know, and this just it sort of reinforces what I've learned from Adlerian psychology, and it just makes so much sense to me. I have to imagine it's making sense to my listeners as well, because they've heard me talk about this, this idea that a child is just valuable and worthy because they are who they are.
Yes. Yeah. And the challenge to do that in this world it's so hard because the culture is pushing exceptionality. Right. Be rich, be beautiful, be thin, be successful, be everything in the extreme. And I'm here talking about the middle ground. I'll tell you a cute joke. When I was putting this all together, actually happened, my husband looked at me and he said, honey, he said, I think this book, it's going to be a flop. And I said,
thanks, babe.
And he said, just think about it. You're here promoting enough in a world that values more. You're here promoting ordinary in a world that's hooked on special. Right?
Yes.
And you're going against the grain. And he said, whether people are really going to listen to you and buy your book, because you're not pushing the exceptionality button.
Right. Right. Because we have so many people that want to know, and as I said, my older daughter's 14, so she's now in high school. And I am seeing this sort of, not a shift, but more of an emphasis than ever before in her education. Now it's all about exceptionality, her grades, her volunteer work, her extracurricular activities, right? And we are a family who kind of, I'm not going to drive my kid 3 hours every day to go to whatever practice, and that's not to say that's a terrible thing to do for anyone who's listening who says, who's doing that. But I think it has to be balanced with other things. But it's so easy to get sucked into the idea that, well, even if I don't believe in it, even if I don't believe in my child being exceptional in every realm that they could, there's also this recognition that if that's where the culture is, then how does my child get into college or get into, go where they're doing? So yeah, it's a tough message to sell, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. But what we really want is children who exceptionality is a wonderful thing and drive to be exceptional is good. But the difference is what drives that exceptionality. If I have to be exceptional so that I end up being better than you, that's very different than if I drive to achieve and to discover something that no one else has discovered because I'm passionate about it.
Mm.
And it's not a comparative thing. It's not that I beat anybody out. I would have been going that way if I was alone.
Right.
And people don't understand the nuanced piece of that. And I would tell you, I have treated more people than I care to count who have ended up in my office, and the drive to be exceptional and to achieve at all costs doesn't look very great at age 55.
Yeah.
When you've got to prove to yourself that you're lovable, that you're smart, that you're capable every day, there's no rest in that paradigm.
Yes. Well, and that just kind of in my head loops me back to what you said earlier about this idea that, we want our children to feel just valuable and worthy because of who they are, as opposed to, I love you because you got straight A's, or I love you because you won your track race, or whatever that particular child is engaged in.
But in this day and age, it's not only hard for kids to do it, but it's hard for parents to do it. And I tell a cute story about this because I have had too many parents over the years in my office who say things to me like, well, I went to the parent meeting and the woman on my right, she just said that her child had been invited to play the violin at Carnegie Hall. And the one on my left had just told me that their child had made the, nationwide soccer team. Mm-hmm. And she said, and I would say, it's hard to feel good about yourself when what you've been working on are things like, and I call these the little but the important predictive things. We've been working on how he can use the word peruse in a sentence accurately, or how to clean the garage and not yell at his sister, or how to make his bed without me having to ask him, or making a homemade birthday card for me and putting it under my pillow. Now, This is where the action is, but nobody's shining a light on those kinds of things. And if I can do anything through this podcast, I want to reassure parents that focusing on those internal skills and abilities are the things that actually predict for success and happiness and fulfillment and contentment. These are the kinds of children that we actually want to raise to be satisfied to themselves.
Yes. I just want to shout that, or have you shout that from the rooftops, because I think if you ask any parent what they really want when they get down to it, it's exactly what you just said, right?
But it doesn't feel very good when everybody around you is saying, well, we got this accolade and that accolade, and we're doing this, that, and the other.
Yeah.
It's hard to be focused on what's important.
Absolutely. I'm curious, and this question doesn't necessarily flow from what you just said, but it's just something that is coming up for me. Do we see anything in the literature or in practice where there are gender differences between who's more likely to have the narcissistic personality disorder? Is there a gender difference?
Well, there was some research that thought anecdotally that reported that it was overrepresented in men, a few more men than women. But there have been clinical observation that that's not necessarily true, and that it's happening across the board. My impression is that it's happening in terms of what I've seen across the board. And I've seen just as many women who are narcissistic as I have men.
Okay. So parents listening, if you've got a girl, this isn't a pass, right?
Yes.
Right.
Right. And I'll give you a quick story that I love to tell, but I treated or met a young woman in my practice, and I asked her, she had basically gone to the best school and she just gotten the best job and she just married the best guy. And when I asked her what her plans were for having children, she said, well, she was planning to have 4. And I said, oh, and she said, yes, that way I'm certain to get one good one. Now,
wow.
That's something where you would think that female instincts and maternal instincts would override. But that's narcissism speaking to us, because it says everything's linked to achievement.
Yeah. And achievement, which it sounds like in this particular case, was going to be demonstrated by having one perfect child, right?
A superstar. And
right.
Right. Uh-huh.
Which I do think maybe it's not clinically diagnosable narcissism, but I do think many of us as parents get caught up in that, in our ego or our success being judged through what our kids accomplish, rather than letting them stand for themselves and us stand for ourselves, right?
I totally agree with that. And I think when you parent toward the little things, the meaningful things, in many cases, you're giving up some of the accolades because you're not putting your children either in those situations, or you're not spending time trying to support them in those specific accomplishments.
Yeah. So it sounds like, really, Dr. Little, we are in such alignment in the sense that moderation parenting, which I think pairs so well with what we talk about in positive discipline, which is balancing kind and firm at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Like those are really, two sides of the same coin.
Yes.
Yeah. This has been a fascinating conversation, I have to say, because, as I said, I've thought about narcissism in a clinical sense and in a in the dangerous space that it exists in, which is the work that I used to do, and have not really heard it talked about in the parenting space and in, what we're doing with our children. And I'm so grateful for this conversation and thrilled that you decided to kind of take everything you were seeing in your practice and help us out as parents, because we need that. And none of us wants to raise a child who has a diagnosable mental health condition that's not treatable, right?
Absolutely. And even more so, I would tell you that if you end up, with the tendencies and traits, those can be treated post-18. Mm-hmm. But all things being equal, you'd like to end up with as little of that as you could have.
Right. Yeah, the further on the spectrum towards the healthy narcissism that we can land our kids, the better, right?
The better, absolutely, because those children will ultimately be kinder, warmer, more sensitive, more engaged. And for you in your old age, actually even children that are better caretakers for you, because they have a firm, loving commitment to you, and they will care for you, your husband, out of affection, not out of duty. And that's our ultimate goal beyond their own happiness, is to have them have a capacity to be meaningful parts of family systems.
Right. Every client that I work with shares with me that, because when we start our work, we talk about, what's your long-term dream? And everyone says, I want my children to want to spend time with me when they are adults, right? That's the big long-term piece here. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like, what you're talking about, this moderation parenting and avoiding some of this specialness, is what's going to land us there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Dr. Little, thank you so much. I know that you've got a website and you're on Twitter and Instagram. We will make sure that all of those links are in our show notes. I'm so grateful to you for being on the podcast today and for sharing this really sort of niche piece of wisdom, but that can make such a big difference for families. Thank you. Thank you. All right, podcast listeners, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation with Dr. Mary Ann Little. I am curious. At the start of this, I said that I thought you might be really pleasantly surprised and take something out of this conversation that you didn't think you would. I know I did. And I'm curious, did that hold true? Did you learn something today that you didn't know? Were you maybe more interested in avoiding narcissism or realizing that, it can happen to you than you thought you might have been? I know I was. I found this information to be really insightful and really in alignment with everything that you have heard me say and talk about on the podcast, on my blog, if you're a part of the Heartful Parent Academy, if you've attended the Safe Parenting Summit, right? All of these things are, I think, we're all talking about the same thing. And so I hope that was really valuable to you. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please email me. And while you're at it, while you're on your computer or your phone, drop a 5-star review wherever it is that you listen to podcasts. I'd be so grateful because it's those 5-star reviews that help bump up this podcast and help more parents find it. Thanks so much, everybody. I'll see you next week.